The Forgotten Mermaid. All Lost Hearts May Be Redeemed by Gregga J. Johnn. Chapter 8. Package was suddenly wearier than he thought he should be and laid down on his mat to sleep. Tang-Tak was still quite unconscious, thanks to Barrel's well-aimed punch. This left Dong to care for the two and keep the fire burning. Dong was not a caring soul by nature, however, and in his thinking, the best thing to do for sleeping invalids was to let them sleep. He quietly exited the little cabin and deftly crept along the pathway opposite the twins and first mate, who had left some minutes before to investigate the light bowl. Dong believed that was a waste of time. Dong knew what it was that they were looking for and was well versed in the ways of the magical. His mother was a river gypsy and raised him with all the lore and tradition of her people. Dong knew he would find her in her den. What he didn't realize was that he had already been found. On the pursuit, Captain Bryce spent most of his days digging through old parchment rolls and book volumes, writing his own copious notes. He kept his cabin door securely locked at all times, and the crew let him be. They were happy to be trusted well enough that they simply sailed as they willed. Occasionally they'd stop at a small island port to stretch their land legs and take on more water. Mama Dee's family stayed closest to the ship and only barely went on to the dock to fetch and load. The young boy Dan scampered around on and off the other ships and learned many rumors of how his brother's escape from hanging had now labeled them as pirates. Mama hobbled around with more bend to her body than necessary. She found the guise of a crippled old crone got her into many places unnoticed. The missionary couple visited religious sanctuaries in each place and sought healing for the preacher man, who continued ill, as his seasickness panned out to be much, much more. Bailey, his devoted wife, hid her distress well within the strength of her womanhood, yet she was not as unaware in preoccupation with her husband's illness as many presumed her to be. Bailey stood outside the captain's cabin while Bryce had gone into town to seek out the wisdom found in the unsteady mind of a village loon. The preacher's wife listened carefully on the quiet ship. She was less and less trusting of this unique captain man. There was something strangely different about his person. Strange sounds came from his cabin, clicking and tapping, and she wasn't sure if she'd heard other voices. She strained her ears, leaning up against the door, trying to understand the whirring that seemed to hum from within. She wished she'd paid more attention to her brother's lessons in thievery. Sighing, Bailey set her heart upon pure intentions again. She had learned by observation what a life of deception can do, but as she stepped back to move away, she found herself leaning heavily up against the full figure of the sudden returned Captain Deleuze. For some reason she didn't move. His body continued breathing steadily against hers as he asked, "Is there something I may help you with, my lady?" She felt strangely at ease with the powerful man. "There were odd noises coming from your cabin." Bailey quietly leaned a little closer to him, just barely, as if shifting her balance. "I was concerned there was something amiss." Bryce leaned his head down toward her neck and whispered in her ear, "Things are amiss, my lady, but only because you perceive them to be." He lifted his hand and gently placed it upon her waist, pressing himself against her more fully as he passed her by in the small hall space. Brazenly leaving his arm around her figure, he unlocked the door before him, pushed it open, and paused to stare deeply into her eyes a moment. Bailey could barely breathe. Her mind raced in 1,000 different directions. The captain smiled, lifted his hand off her, and tapped the outer corner of his eye with his finger in a strange salute. "Good day, my lady," he said. Then he bowed slightly and walked into the depths of his room. The lady stood immovable, staring after him, unable to contend against his gentle confidence. He tossed his hat upon the desk and turned to gaze upon her figure again. Then he smiled, slyly winked at her, and made a slight gesture with his fingers that she almost didn't catch. It was as if he beckoned something to pass by his person, but then the door slammed shut of its own will. Bailey was left baffled without. Digby, Barrel, and the silent galley picked their way through the wreckage that continued to wash up onto the shore. They should have realized there was a distinct lack of bloated dead flesh being washed up also, but they didn't. Galley and Barrel were the best of mates, so naturally there was some eager roughhousing between them as they raced each other to pick through the various treasures left on the sand. Digby made his way along the rock platform that hugged the cliff face at the beach's end. He found a few knickknacks here and there among the rocky pools, like the surgeon's bag that was splayed out with various instruments rolling on the tidal rocks. Digby thought he might gain favour with the gentleman if he returned such belongings to him, but then he saw them. Deep under the waters, in one of the hollow column pools, the sailor recognized a shelf of oysters. They sat, sucking water in and out of the semi-clothed shelves, and Digby's curiosity got the better of him. He picked up the scalpel that rolled by on the rocky shelf and reached down nearly a full arm's length to cut away and pull up the topmost oyster. He sat there watching his reflection out of the corner of his eye as he shucked open the shell to feast upon the delicacy inside, but stopped short in wonder. A pearl the size of his pinky finger gleamed into his greedy eyes. He reached to pull the pearl out of its holding when suddenly the oyster slammed shut, cutting off both his fingertips. A violet flash with a violent screech filled his senses in discord with his own cry. The column of water inside the tidal pool burst upwards, encased the man in his distress, and then pulled him down into the hidden depths of the pool. The tide continued gently rolling the doctor's scalpel as it lay alone on the bloody rock shelf-top. "Darling," Barnabas inquired, "you look pale. Are you unwell?" Bailey smiled weakly and took a deep breath of the clean ocean air. She stood leaning against the ship's side, looking out to sea. Her husband sat with his back leaning against the central mast, winding a net together as Davies had taught him. "I don't know why," continued the preacher man, "but I always feel much more energized when I sit here." He patted the space next to him. "Perhaps you will feel better too if you come sit by me." The dock behind them was a bustle, and the brothers carted new barrels of fresh water and oranges below deck. Mamma D hobbled aboard, and Bailey offered her a sudden assistance to distract her thoughts away from her wistful wandering. "I am more than well, my dear," the wife assured her husband. Barnabas smiled and settled back into his work, satisfied that all was well. Mamma D, however, glanced up into the pretty eyes of the robust woman and questioned her with a furrowed grin. Bailey averted her eyes from the silent inquisition, so Mamma left well enough alone until later. On the beach, Galley wrestled the mighty Barrel. Laughter filled the island coastline, and the wind flapped happily through torn sails on castaway rigging. Barrel growled in aggressive, eager tones as Galley, still not speaking a word, pushed against the man and egged him on. In his haste to outrun the hulking chaser, Galley got his feet caught in a seaweedy mess of ropes and fell splayed outward upon a mess of wreckage. He paused a moment, unsure if he'd hurt himself or not. Barrel came up behind and picked him up off the pile. They both looked down as closer inspection revealed a solid iron pike sticking out of the wood. Yet Galley's shirt was still clean and dry, so both laughed in relief and moved away from the hazard. As the wind whipped up cooler, they began gathering all the driest wood they could find to carry back to the cabin as per their assignment. Heading back up the cliff face, they forgot entirely about Digby. Outside the cabin, Dr. Scranton and Reverend Tungsten were cleaning and gutting a goodly catch of fish, as well as one excellent octopus, whose head was soundly beaten against the rocks before being tossed into a slowly boiling pot. "Smells good," Barrel said. Galley nodded in agreement and took to chopping the spring onions that the doctor had found growing on the cliff-top field. "I'd say it was a good day's work." The Reverend nodded and wiped his scale-splattered face. He smiled and continued scraping the skins of the silvery fish. Dr. Scranton tossed his hair back and suggested, "Barrel, would you tell the two sleeping in the cabin that dinner will be ready soon? They'll want to eat to regain their strength." Barrel turned to head inside, but paused a moment, concerned for the obviously shaking hands of his cooking mate. Galley smiled and shook his head to clear his cloudy mind. He laid the knife down a minute to catch his breath. Scranton laid a hand on Galley's shoulder and asked, "Are you feeling okay?" Galley nodded and shook off the concern with a smile. He sniffed deeply over the softly boiling octopus and rubbed his belly. "Yeah," agreed the ship's surgeon. "We'll all feel better with food now, Belly." Barrel opened the hut door and stepped back with a snort and a gasp. There was a foul smell coming from inside. Reverend Tungsten cautiously peeked in, stopped and cursed. "God damn, what the—" His voice trailed off in disbelief. As the door swung open wider, the four men stared in at the two sailors they had presumed were sleeping. Both men were obviously dead, and already infested with a full day's worth of feasting flies. Package lay with his cut-off wrist resting gently on his chest. The hand was missing again, and his entire torso was covered in the blood of his bleeding out. Tang-Tak also lay in a pool of blood that leaked, putrid and sticky, all over the floor from where his legs seemed to have never grown back after all. But Barrel spoke. "We all saw they had healed." He turned to the gentleman for an explanation. "How did we see that they had been healed?" There was a gasp behind them, and the three turned to see horror on Gally's face as he stared down at his shoulder. He blinked up at them as the iron pike-sized hole pumped out the last of his blood, and he collapsed onto the ground. "But you missed it!" Barrel ran to hold his mate in the dying gasps. In his disbelief, Barrel kept repeating over and over, "You missed it! You missed it! You missed it!" But Gally died, seeing reality in the cuts and bruises and truly dishevelled appearances of the three shipwrecked men standing before him. The siren watched with an amused grin from the mirror portal in the boiling water pot. Eyes are easily deceived by illusionary magic. She blinked her long black lashes and licked the dripping blood off her full black lips. Her belly was rounded, as was her larder full of sailor parts. Digby sat moaning in a cage, cradling his missing-fingered hand in horror, while our pretty violet siren munched contentedly upon Dong's liver.